My fellow Americans, I have spoken to you from this historic office on many occasions and about many things.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at disastrous political and economic choices from the 1980s that even decades later reverberate across the globe.
The tanker, the Exxon Valdez, had just loaded more than 1 million barrels of Alaskan crude.
Latin American debt crisis. Borrow, borrow, and borrow some more. This was the economic philosophy of many Latin American nations during the 1960s and 70s. Lured in by low-interest loans, they sought to fund ambitious infrastructure projects and modernize their nations.
¿Quieren ganar dinero? Vengan, vengan.
Then the 1980s came and brought with it a perfect economic storm. Global recessions, soaring interest rates, and plummeting oil prices. Countries like Brazil and Mexico found themselves drowning in debt, unable to keep up with mounting interest payments. The crisis peaked in 1982.
After August of '82, pretty much all of Latin American countries defaulted.
Mexico announced to the world that it could no longer meet its debt obligations. For Latin America, the 1980s was La Década Perdida, or the lost decade. Economies stagnated, unemployment skyrocketed, and widespread social unrest spread across South America. Savings and loan crisis. By 1986, U.S. local banks faced an existential crisis. Originally, savings and loan banks specialized in long-term fixed-rate mortgages. Stability was everything, and stable interest rates made mortgages safe for both homeowners and banks. A soaring inflation of the late 1970s changed everything.
As inflationary expectations have been worsened, business and other borrowers are also tempted to use credit to finance speculative ventures.
The Federal Reserve stepped in, hiking interest rates dramatically. This shift left S&Ls in a bind. They were paying higher interest on new deposits while stuck with low-yield long-term loans. Enter Reagan-era deregulation.
Well, this administration's objective will be a healthy, vigorous, growing economy that provides equal opportunities for all Americans with no barriers.
Without anyone looking over their shoulders, S&Ls ventured into the realm of high-risk investing without any expertise whatsoever. Reckless lending and fraud were rampant.
We will not rest until the cheats and the chiselers and the charlatans spend a large chunk of their lives behind the bars of a federal prison.
By the mid-90s, nearly a third of S&Ls collapsed. American taxpayers had to shell out over $100 billion in bailouts.
And now we know what happens when you destroy financial regulation. You produce a financial catastrophe.
Worldwide failure to manage HIV/AIDS. In the early 1980s, gay communities were struck by fear of a nameless disease.
The only thing I can liken it to is a war zone, but most of us have never lived in a war zone, but you never knew where the bomb was going to drop.
Rumors spread of a gay cancer striking at the heart of the community. The disease, which turned out to be HIV/AIDS, wasn't just ignored by world governments. It was politicized to an appalling degree.
Last Friday, I started noticing a difficulty swallowing. And it got progressively worse over the weekend to the point where I didn't want to eat.
Religious leaders and policymakers around the world dragged their feet. Some even called AIDS divine punishment. In America, President Reagan stayed silent for years, letting the crisis explode. By the time action was taken, millions were infected worldwide.
People who, because they had been diagnosed, suddenly disappeared. And we all knew what that silence meant.
It wasn't just a public health disaster, it was a worldwide moral failure. The tide finally turned in 2003 with PEPFAR, an aid program that has saved over 25 million lives.
Ladies and gentlemen, seldom has history offered a greater opportunity to do so much for so many.
Soviet war in Afghanistan. It's Christmas 1979, and Soviet tanks are rolling into Afghanistan.
The first Soviet invasion of a country outside the Eastern Bloc since World War II.
Communist superpower is hoping to prop up a faltering communist government in the face of overwhelming Islamic resistance. Moscow envisioned a swift intervention. What they found was a grueling, decade-long quagmire. Soviet forces faced huge resistance from the Mujahideen. Islamic rebels were bolstered by covert American support and supplies.
Tonight, the Russians accuse the United States of preparing to give the rebels in Afghanistan massive supplies of arms and equipment.
The war drained USSR's coffers, sapped its morale, and was a significant contributing factor to their eventual collapse. Unfortunately, America fared no better. They refused to contribute to the country's rebuilding after more than 1 million civilians were killed. They left a vacuum that would ultimately be filled by both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
And the Taliban came marching along from Kandahar to city to city to city, saying, we're going to make the cities safe for you again.
The Tiananmen Square massacre. Students have been the cornerstone of civil protests for centuries, espousing lofty ideals in search of justice and social change. In the spring of 1989, however, thousands of Chinese students found only sorrow. They flooded into Tiananmen Square, demanding political reform and personal freedom.
They turned Tiananmen Square, the country's symbol of sovereignty, into a hub of dissent and protest.
They staged peaceful protests for weeks as the world looked on, hopeful that it could spark a new Chinese revolution. When June rolled in, those hopes were dashed. The Chinese government sent in troops and tanks to quell the unrest. The military massacred unarmed civilians, scattering or arresting survivors.
One man alone, of course, can't stop an army. Except for a moment, that's exactly what happened here. For 3 minutes in the middle of the day, an army was stopped by a man who stood still.
The official death toll is unknown, with estimates ranging from a few hundred to several thousand.
30 years on, it is still impossible to openly mark the anniversary in mainland China. Vigils are held every year in Hong Kong, attended by tens of thousands.
The crackdown crushed any potential reform movement, ushering in decades of iron-fisted rule. African famine crisis and mismanagement. Famines have occurred for all of human history. Oftentimes, Mother Nature is at fault. The African famines starting in the 1980s are a different story.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine.
They began with horrific droughts exacerbated by governmental mismanagement. Civil wars, corruption, and Cold War politics turned localized food shortages into mass starvation. Ethiopia's 1983-85 famine was the worst, killing over 1 million people by some estimates.
The most difficult thing that I can never forget in my life is that to go into the camp and choose from make a choice of those young children, lactating mothers, and elderly people.
All the while, local warlords and corrupt officials hoarded aid. Somalia and Sudan faced similar tragedies, with famines lasting long into the next decade and beyond. The global response was and is still slow and inadequate. Even Live Aid's record-breaking charity concert failed to fix systemic issues. The region is now trapped in a decades-long cycle of dependency, economic ruin, and mass death. Exxon Valdez oil spill. In the wee hours of March 24, 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker was steaming through the Prince William Sound. Unfortunately, against company policy, only one officer was on the bridge. Suddenly, it crashed into Bligh Reef, tearing open its hull and releasing almost 11 million gallons of crude oil into the pristine Alaskan waters.
I want to assure everyone that Exxon is mobilizing all available resources to mitigate the impact from this incident.
This environmental catastrophe devastated local wildlife, killing hundreds of thousands of seabirds, otters, seals, and whales. The spill spread over 1,300 miles of coastline, making containment and cleanup efforts incredibly challenging.
The storm had come up and the oil was moving, and almost nothing could be done.
It also devastated multiple local economies, especially indigenous coastal communities. The incident led to changes in environmental regulations and spurred advancements in oil spill response strategies. Sadly, those strategies have had to be employed time and time again.
The news was again filled with the struggle to contain a massive spill.
Iran-Contra affair. In one of the most backhanded and absurd confessions in political history, Ronald Reagan addressed the nation in March 1987. His speech was a masterclass in self-serving moralism.
A few months ago, I told the American people I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me it is not.
What did he mean? You know that whole Iran-Contra denial? Well, turns out I did it. The Iran-Contra scandal was a tangled web of illegal arms sales to Iran, with the proceeds used to secretly fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua. It was an end-around Congress who banned that aid to the Contras.
The amendment restricted the CIA and Department of Defense from using funds to provide military assistance to groups that were trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government.
When exposed, it shattered Reagan's image as a supposed straight shooter. Fortunately for the Gipper, some of his aides fell on their swords. Reagan walked away largely unscathed. The scandal further eroded trust in the government and set a terrible precedent for future presidential misdeeds.
There are reasons why it happened, but no excuses. It was a mistake.
Chernobyl disaster. Few disasters have been as nearly apocalyptic as the Chernobyl meltdown.
The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Soviet nuclear power plant exploded, unleashing a radioactive nightmare. The disaster was caused by a lethal mix of flawed reactor design and human error.
When the worst American nuclear accident occurred at 3 Mile Island, most leaking radiation was kept inside the containment building. Unlike this Soviet accident, where radiation has been measured 600 to 1,000 miles away.
The Soviet culture of secrecy delayed evacuation and caused more suffering. When people were finally moved out of Pripyat, it was too late. Thousands were already exposed to deadly radiation. The Soviet Union downplayed the catastrophe, but the truth leaked out when radiation alarms went off in Sweden. Chernobyl is now a ghost city, its former citizens left to suffer with lingering health crises. Decades later, the exclusion zone remains a threat thanks to the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The Ukrainian government says a fire broke out after a Russian drone struck the shelter of the destroyed power unit at the plant.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications.
America props up dictators around the world. After World War II, America made one thing clear. Communism was the ultimate enemy.
It has been a global threat, manifesting itself from the Far East to Europe.
To fight it, Washington was willing to make deals with devils in every corner of the globe. From Pinochet in Chile to Mobutu in Zaire, America propped up brutal strongmen across developing nations. But the 1980s saw this strategy unravel spectacularly. The Reagan administration funneled cash and weapons to violent regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala. There, death squads massacred civilians.
Beginning, it's a first step. It should not be read, as far as I can tell, as a suggestion that either this administration wants or suggests to the American public in general that we are condoning, that we are sanctioning events that are occurring within Guatemala.
In the Philippines, U.S.-backed dictator Ferdinand Marcos looted billions. Even Saddam Hussein received American support during the Iran-Iraq War.
Isn't that interesting? There I am.
The world's city on a hill turned a blind eye to widespread suffering, all in the name of stability, and it failed. The blowback still haunts America today. Is there a particular decision you think the world is still paying for? Let us know down in the comments.
I asked so many questions about the hostages' welfare that I didn't ask enough about the specifics of the total Iran plan.